Emily Carter sat curled up on the edge of her bed, the soft white sheets pulled tightly around her small frame, as if they could protect her from the weight pressing against her chest. The dim lights of the Manhattan skyline spilled in through the tall windows of the penthouse, painting fractured reflections across the glass walls. She trembled, her lips quivering as the words slipped out in a whisper barely audible even to herself. "Please, no more." Her voice seemed to vanish in the vast silence of the apartment, swallowed by the endless hum of the city below. At just 7 years old, Emily already carried fears too heavy for her fragile shoulders. She wasn't pleading with a person standing over her. She was pleading with the relentless pressure that seemed to live within those polished marble walls. And then the door burst open. Richard Carter, her father, stormed inside. He wasn't the kind of man who knocked softly or entered quietly. His presence filled the room the way his reputation filled Wall Street, overwhelming, unstoppable, almost intimidating. His expensive suit still carried the faint scent of the city, the sharpness of cologne layered over the exhaustion of long hours. He froze when he saw her. For the briefest moment, his confident posture faltered, his face showing something other than control. Yet he quickly masked it, forcing a tone that balanced frustration with a shaky attempt at gentleness. "Emily," he said, his voice low but firm, "what's going on? Why are you crying again?" Emily shrank deeper into the sheets, clutching a stuffed rabbit so worn it looked like it had survived decades of love. She didn't answer, her wide blue eyes fixed on him like a deer caught between fear and hope. Richard sighed heavily, loosening his tie as though it were the source of his discomfort. He was a man celebrated in magazines as a symbol of power, of success, the self-made millionaire who had climbed from nothing to own half a dozen skyscrapers in New York. Yet here, in the quiet of his daughter's bedroom, he felt powerless. For weeks, Emily's whispers had haunted him, though he refused to admit it out loud. He told himself she was just sensitive, maybe spoiled by too much comfort. But tonight, there was something raw in her trembling, something that even a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals couldn't ignore. The silence stretched. He took a few steps closer, the sound of his polished shoes against the hardwood echoing through the room. "Emily," he said again, softer this time, "I need you to talk to me. What do you mean by no more?" Her small voice finally broke through. "The lessons, the pressure, it's too much." Her words tumbled out in fragments, her eyes filling with tears she tried to hide. "I can't do it anymore, Daddy." Richard's throat tightened. He was used to boardrooms where every phrase was a weapon, every silence a negotiation. But here, facing his daughter's truth, he felt stripped of every skill he thought made him strong. Outside, a siren wailed faintly, fading into the endless buzz of the city. Inside, the weight between father and daughter settled like a storm that refused to pass. Richard sat on the edge of her bed, careful not to crush the blanket fortress she had built around herself. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a breath that carried both exhaustion and a glimmer of vulnerability, he murmured, "Emily, I don't want to hurt you. I just want what's best for you." But even as the words left his mouth, he wondered if he truly knew what best meant for her, or if he had only ever been chasing what had been denied to him in his own childhood. The tension remained unbroken, yet beneath it flickered the faintest possibility of change. For the first time in years, Richard felt the sharp edge of a question he couldn't ignore. Was his empire built on foundations strong enough to hold a daughter's fragile heart? Before we continue unraveling Emily's world and Richard's struggle to bridge the chasm between wealth and love, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way you'll stay with us for every step of this emotional journey. The night pressed on, but the silence between father and daughter carried the weight of something deeper, a story just beginning. Richard Carter had always been defined by motion, never still, never satisfied, always climbing. To the public eye, he was the embodiment of the American dream, a man who had grown up on the rougher streets of Chicago, who had carried boxes in freezing winters and taken night shifts at corner stores just to keep food on the table. From there, he clawed his way into the world of real estate, learning the language of contracts, risk, and ambition, until he transformed himself into a figure of power in New York City. But behind the polish of success lay the iron bars of distance, especially between him and his only daughter. The Carter penthouse was a monument to Richard's achievements, glass walls stretching toward the Manhattan skyline, polished stone floors that reflected every beam of light, and shelves lined with artifacts from travels he had taken alone. It was a home in size only. Its grandeur could not disguise the emptiness that echoed through its vast rooms. Richard had always told himself he was doing it all for Emily. Every late-night meeting, every deal struck in skyscrapers overlooking Central Park, every photo in glossy magazines showing him beside mayors and governors, it was all in his mind to secure her future. Yet when he stepped into her room and saw her trembling beneath a blanket, he was forced to admit that his vision of security might not resemble hers at all. The truth was, Richard hadn't known how to be close to her. Since her mother had left when Emily was barely 3, he had buried himself in work. Love to him had been a battlefield he had lost too early. To feel was to risk, and risk was something he avoided everywhere but in business. Now his daughter's silence mirrored the silence he had lived through as a boy. He remembered the heavy footsteps of his own father coming home after 12-hour shifts at the steel mill. His father never asked how Richard felt, never praised him, never once said the words he had longed to hear. Affection was absent in that house, and the lessons of distance had been passed down like heirlooms. "Daddy?" Emily's soft voice broke the current of his thoughts. She was still clutching her stuffed rabbit, its ear pressed against her cheek. "Yes, sweetheart," he answered, though the word felt foreign on his tongue. "Why do you always work so late?" Her eyes searched him with a quiet desperation, as though the answer carried her worth. He hesitated. The instinct was to say, "I'm doing this for you." But even he no longer fully believed it. So instead, he cleared his throat and replied, "Because I want to make sure you have everything you need, a good home, good schools. Opportunities that most children never get." Emily's lips pressed together. She nodded, but her gaze slipped downward. She didn't want opportunities. She wanted presence. Richard saw it, though he couldn't admit it aloud. He felt a sting in his chest, a tension he didn't know how to loosen. He had built his life by ignoring vulnerability, but Emily's question left no room for armor. Later that night, when she was asleep, Richard stood by the window of the living room, the city glowing beneath him like an endless sea of fireflies. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. The tailored suit, the sharp jawline, the emblem of control. Yet his eyes betrayed him. They looked hollow. He remembered the laughter of the gala earlier that week, men sipping bourbon and joking about rich kids raised by nannies. At the time, Richard had brushed it off, pretending it didn't sting. But now, the joke replayed in his mind like an accusation. Was he becoming the kind of father he had once resented? The hum of the city offered no answers. Only Emily's whispered plea, still echoing in his memory. "Please, no more." Richard clenched his fists at his sides. He didn't know how to fix this distance, but for the first time, he felt the urgency of trying. The question hung in the air, demanding resolution. Could a man who conquered skyscrapers learn how to hold a child's fragile heart? The penthouse was silent in the mornings, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the oversized clock on the wall. Emily's days began not with warmth, but with routine. Helen, her nanny, would gently wake her, brush her hair into neat braids and prepare a carefully measured breakfast. It was the same table every day, long enough to host 20 guests, but occupied only by Emily and Helen. The absence of her father at those breakfasts was no longer surprising. It was expected. Emily ate quietly, nibbling at toast or pushing scrambled eggs around her plate, while Helen tried to fill the silence. "You've got piano today after school," Helen would remind her softly. "And don't forget your reading assignment for Miss Thompson." "Yes, ma'am," Emily replied, her voice polite but distant, like an echo trained by repetition. When Helen smiled at her, Emily returned it faintly, though her eyes betrayed the heaviness of a child who longed for something more than schedules. She wanted laughter at the breakfast table, the kind she sometimes overheard from families at diners when Helen took her out on weekends. Instead, Her mornings were wrapped in order and quiet, shaped by the routines of a life that looked perfect on the outside. At school, the loneliness followed her. Emily was bright, often drawing pictures of cityscapes with details that surprised even her teacher. But when it came to speaking in front of others, she froze. Her small frame tensed, her hands shook, and her words shrank into whispers. Classmates didn't mock her, most simply overlooked her, gravitating toward louder personalities. Emily sat in the middle rows unnoticed, her silence forming an invisible wall around her. One afternoon, Sarah Thompson knelt beside her desk. "Emily, you're very talented," she said, pointing to a sketch of Central Park Emily had drawn during free time. "Why don't you share it with the class?" Emily's heart pounded. Her fingers gripped the paper as if letting go would expose her to something unbearable. She shook her head, whispering, "Please, no." Sarah studied her with concern, sensing that the fear went deeper than ordinary shyness. Still, she placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "That's all right, you don't have to today." But the moment lingered, leaving the teacher unsettled. Back at the penthouse, Emily's afternoons blurred into a rigid structure of lessons. A piano teacher arrived at 3, her stern voice filling the otherwise quiet rooms. "Again," the teacher would say, tapping the sheet music. "You must keep your fingers steady, Emily. No mistakes this time." Emily's small hands trembled over the keys, pressing them with a mixture of effort and dread. She wanted to please, wanted to be perfect, because every adult around her seemed to expect it. But each wrong note tightened the knot in her chest. Sometimes she bit her lip so hard she left tiny marks, willing herself not to cry. Helen often lingered at the door, watching with a worried expression. She tried afterward to soften the edges of Emily's day. "You played beautifully, darling," she reassured her, handing her a glass of warm milk before bed. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Emily nodded, forcing a small smile. But when she lay down at night, she pulled her stuffed rabbit close and whispered the same words she had whispered before. "Please, no more." She wasn't just asking to stop the lessons. She was asking for relief from the weight pressing down on her small world, the weight of expectations, of absence, of feeling unseen, even in a home that gleamed like a palace. Helen kissed her forehead, whispering, "Sleep well, sweetheart." Then she turned off the light, leaving Emily with the glow of the city skyline. Alone in the vast room, Emily closed her eyes and wished for something simple, not riches, not perfection, but the warmth of a father's voice telling her she was enough. The loneliness clung to her like a shadow, and though she didn't yet know it, those whispers of fear were beginning to echo in places Richard could no longer ignore. The Plaza Hotel glittered that night, like a palace pulled from another age, its chandeliers casting golden light across marble floors, polished to perfection. Richard Carter moved easily through the crowd of business leaders, investors, and socialites, his tailored tuxedo fitting him like armor. He shook hands, exchanged sharp smiles, and spoke in the language of power, mergers, numbers, expansions. For years, these rooms had been his kingdom. Yet even in the midst of praise and admiration, something gnawed at him. The image of Emily sitting small and silent in her room lingered at the edge of his mind, impossible to shake. He had silenced that thought countless times before, convincing himself he was building her future. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, it clung tighter than usual. Near the bar, laughter erupted. A group of men, all fellow moguls, clinked glasses of bourbon, their voices carried easily across the hall. "Can you believe it?" One of them chuckled, his tone dripping with arrogance. "These kids of ours, raised in penthouses, surrounded by nannies, don't even know what a real family looks like." Another joined in. "Yeah, I walked into my son's school the other day. Teacher told me he barely speaks in class. I said, 'That's what I pay you for.'" He roared with laughter, his belly shaking beneath his vest. Richard smirked out of habit, preparing to step past them. But then the first man added, "I bet half of us don't even know what our kids really feel. Rich kids grow up lonely, that's the price. At least we get the deals signed." The words landed harder than Richard expected. For a brief second, his chest tightened. He forced a polite laugh, nodding as though he agreed. But the echo of Emily's whispered voice, "Please, no more," slid back into his mind. He excused himself quickly, moving toward the quieter side of the ballroom. His drink sat untouched in his hand as he stared at his reflection in the tall windows. Manhattan glittered outside, skyscrapers piercing the night sky, every building a monument to ambition. But instead of pride, he felt a hollowness spreading. A colleague, Daniel Miller, noticed him standing apart. "Richard," Daniel said, stepping closer, "you look like you've seen a ghost." Richard straightened his shoulders. "Just thinking." "Thinking?" Daniel's tone carried both curiosity and concern. "That's not usually your style at these events." Richard tried to brush it off. "Business never sleeps, you know." But Daniel's eyes narrowed, reading him more closely than most dared to. They had known each other since Chicago, before the wealth, before the fame. Daniel knew the man behind the headlines. "You've got everything people dream about," Daniel said quietly, "but you look like you're carrying a weight no one else can see." Richard didn't respond. He just took a sip of the bourbon he hadn't wanted, letting its burn distract him. Later, as he left the gala, the city air hit him like a jolt. The streets pulsed with late-night energy, yellow cabs darting between traffic, street vendors selling hot dogs, the rumble of subways beneath the ground. Richard usually thrived on that rhythm, but tonight he felt detached, as though the city was moving forward while he stood still. In the back of his car, he loosened his bow tie and leaned against the leather seat. The driver asked where to, and Richard simply muttered, "Home." On the ride back to the penthouse, the conversation from the gala replayed in his head. He told himself the men were careless, joking the way powerful men often did. But their words had peeled something open inside him, exposing a truth he didn't want to face. His daughter's loneliness wasn't invisible anymore. It was becoming undeniable. And for the first time, Richard Carter, the man who prided himself on control, wondered if he was losing the one thing he could never buy back: his daughter's trust. The following week carried its usual rhythm of meetings, contracts, and late nights at the office. Richard buried himself in spreadsheets and negotiations, trying to ignore the faint unease that had taken root since the gala. But unease had a way of finding its way back, and this time it arrived in the form of a folded envelope tucked inside Emily's backpack. Helen handed it to him that evening as he set his briefcase down in the penthouse foyer. "This came from Miss Thompson," she explained gently, "Emily's teacher." Richard frowned, sliding a finger under the seal. "Another note about assignments?" Helen shook her head, her expression serious. "I think you should read it." He opened the letter, expecting formality. Instead, the words struck deeper than he anticipated. "Mr. Carter, I am writing to share some concerns about Emily's well-being in class. She is bright, capable, and very talented in art, but she struggles with fear when asked to participate. She trembles, avoids eye contact, and whispers instead of speaking. This is not merely shyness. It seems to reflect something heavier. I encourage you to spend more time with her, not only on academics, but in ways that build her confidence and sense of security. Children need presence more than perfection." The letter ended with a handwritten note. "She doesn't need the world from you. She just needs you." Richard stood frozen in the hallway, the paper trembling faintly in his hands. The words, "She trembles," carved into him like a blade. He had seen it at home, though he had brushed it aside. Emily's whispered pleas, the way she clutched her rabbit as though it were armor. But here it was, confirmed by someone outside their walls, someone who had no reason to exaggerate. Helen watched him, her voice soft but steady. "She's not saying Emily is failing, Richard. She's saying Emily is hurting." He closed the letter sharply, as if shutting it could undo its truth. "Teachers always overanalyze," he muttered. "She's fine. Kids are sensitive." But later that night, long after the penthouse had gone quiet and Emily was asleep, Richard sat alone in his study with the letter unfolded again on his desk. His whiskey sat untouched, the amber liquid reflecting the dim desk lamp. He read the words over and over. "She trembles, she whispers, she needs you." His chest tightened. He thought of his own childhood, of nights waiting for his father to look at him, to ask about his day, to notice him. The memory stung because he had vowed to be different. Yet here he was, a man with wealth beyond what his father had ever dreamed, failing at the one role that mattered most. A voice broke the silence. It was Emily's, faint in memory. "Daddy, why do you always work so late?" He pressed a hand to his forehead, leaning back in the leather chair. For the first time in years, the empire he had built felt flimsy. Skyscrapers couldn't shelter a child's heart, and money couldn't replace the comfort of presence. Helen peeked into the study, hesitant. "You're still awake." Richard glanced up, his jaw tight. "Do you think she's scared of me?" Helen stepped inside slowly. "She's not scared of you, Richard. She's scared of being invisible to you. That's different." The distinction pierced him. He nodded stiffly, unable to find words. Helen left him with his silence, and he stared at the letter once more, as though it demanded an answer he wasn't ready to give. The city outside pulsed with its usual life, horns, lights, the hum of everything moving forward. But inside the penthouse, Richard Carter sat in stillness, his empire momentarily forgotten, holding a piece of paper that carried more weight than any contract he had ever signed. The crack in his armor was widening, and whether he wanted to or not, he would have to face what lay beneath. The letter stayed on Richard's desk for days, folded and refolded until the edges wore thin. He carried it in his briefcase, telling himself he would respond later, yet every time he touched it, a knot tightened in his chest. Finally, one evening, he decided to confront the truth, not the letter itself, but the daughter whose silence had become impossible to ignore. Emily was in her room, her rabbit tucked under her arm, colored pencils scattered across the floor. She was drawing again, sketches of tall buildings, wide bridges, and small figures standing alone beneath them. Richard paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. He wondered if she drew cities because she was surrounded by them, or if the lonely figures at their base were her way of whispering what she couldn't speak aloud. "Emily," he said, his voice firm but softened at the edges. She looked up quickly, her eyes widening in that mixture of surprise and apprehension he was beginning to recognize. "Yes, Daddy." He stepped inside, crouching down beside her drawings. "What are these?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the outline of one figure. "Just pictures." "They're good," he admitted, though the compliment sounded awkward in his mouth. "Oh, you're very talented." Emily gave a small nod, but her shoulders stayed tense. Richard exhaled slowly. "Emily, I got a letter from your teacher." Her pencil stilled. She lowered her gaze. "Miss Thompson?" "Yes. She said you don't like to speak in class, that you tremble when you're asked questions. Is that true?" Emily's cheeks flushed pink. She bit her lip, fidgeting with the edge of her rabbit's ear. Finally, she whispered, "Sometimes." "Why?" His tone came sharper than intended, as though he were interrogating her instead of asking. Her eyes glistened. "Because I don't want to make mistakes. I don't want people to be mad at me." Richard frowned. "No one is going to be mad at you for speaking, Emily. You're smart. You know the answers." But she shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "You get mad, Kaya, when I don't do things right. The piano, the reading, everything. You want me to be perfect." Her words landed like blows. Richard tried to respond, but his throat tightened. He had always thought discipline and pressure were the tools that shaped success. Yet here was his daughter, trembling under the very weight he thought would protect her future. "Emily," he said more softly now, reaching toward her but stopping short of touching her hand, "I don't want to hurt you. I just want you to grow strong." Her whisper broke through, fragile and haunting. "Please, no more." The words echoed in the room, and Richard felt them settle deep in his chest. He had heard her say it before, but tonight, looking into her tear-filled eyes, he finally understood. This wasn't about stubbornness or childish defiance. It was a plea for mercy, a call from a heart too small to carry the weight he had placed on it. He sat back, running a hand over his face. Silence stretched between them, heavy and raw. Emily wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, hugging the rabbit closer. "Do you still love me even if I'm not perfect?" The question nearly undid him. He swallowed hard, his voice breaking despite his effort to remain composed. Of course I love you. More than anything. But even as he spoke, he wondered if she truly believed him. The city lights outside flickered against the windows, and in that quiet room, Richard Carter faced something no deal or contract had ever prepared him for, the fragility of a child's trust and the possibility that he had already begun to lose it. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with a silence that demanded he choose between the empire he had built and the little girl who trembled under its shadow. Richard Carter was not a man who sought counsel. He built his empire by trusting his instincts, silencing doubts and proving wrong anyone who dared to question his path. But after the confrontation with Emily, silence no longer comforted him. Her whispered plea, "Please no more," echoed relentlessly in his mind. It was Daniel Miller who noticed the change first. Old friends since Chicago, Daniel had been by Richard's side long before skyscrapers bore his name. Now his lawyer and confidant Daniel could read him in ways others couldn't. So when Richard walked into his office on a grey Tuesday morning, shoulders heavy, Daniel didn't bother with small talk. "You look like hell," Daniel said, closing a file and leaning back in his chair. Richard smirked faintly. "Good morning to you too." Daniel folded his arms. "What's going on? Don't tell me it's the market." "You've faced worse dips without blinking." Richard hesitated, his gaze falling to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. For once, he didn't feel like the man who owned that view. "It's not business," he admitted quietly. "It's Emily." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Your daughter? What about her?" Richard exhaled, running a hand through his hair. She's not happy. Her teacher sent me a letter. Says Emily trembles in class, won't speak up. At home she whispers that she can't take it anymore. I don't understand it. I've given her everything." Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady but pointed. "Everything money can buy, but not the one thing she actually needs." Richard looked up sharply, defensive instinct rising. "Don't start. You know what I came from." "I swore she'd never feel that kind of struggle." Daniel didn't flinch. "And yet she's struggling, Richard, just in a different way. You can't buy your daughter's love. You can't negotiate trust like a deal. You have to show up for her." The words stung because they were true. Richard clenched his jaw, staring at the polished desk as though it could shield him from the truth. Daniel softened his tone, though his eyes stayed firm. "Look, I know you. You think strength means building towers and never bending, but Emily doesn't need a titan. She needs a father." The word landed heavily. Father. Richard had spent years being everything else, provider, protector, empire builder, but in that moment he wondered if he had forgotten the simplest role of all. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice low, almost vulnerable. "Start small," Daniel said. "Take her out, just the two of you. No work, no assistants, no piano teachers. One weekend where she sees you, not the businessman, not the headline, but you." Richard shook his head. "I wouldn't even know where to begin." "You don't have to plan it like a merger," Daniel replied with a faint smile. "Just be with her. Listen. Let her show you who she is. Trust me, Richard, she's not asking for the world, she's asking for you." The office fell silent. Outside, the city roared with its usual energy, but inside, Richard felt the quiet weight of choice pressing down. Daniel leaned forward once more, his voice steady. "You can keep building towers until the skyline carries your name. But if you lose her, what's the point? At the end of the day, who's going to sit beside you when the lights go out? A skyscraper can't hug you back." Richard swallowed hard, the truth sinking deeper than he wanted to admit. He rose from the chair, gathering his coat, his expression unreadable. "Maybe you're right," he muttered. Daniel gave him a knowing look. "Not maybe, Richard." "Definitely." As Richard left the office, the city stretched before him, vast, powerful, yet strangely empty. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about contracts or expansions. He was thinking about a little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit, whispering for the world to stop pressing so hard. And he knew Daniel was right. Something had to change. Saturday morning arrived with an unfamiliar quiet. For the first time in years, Richard Carter had cleared his calendar. No meetings, no calls, no endless stream of assistance buzzing in his ear. It felt unnatural, almost uncomfortable, but Daniel's words still echoed, "She doesn't need the world, she needs you." Emily shuffled into the kitchen in her pajamas, clutching her rabbit. She blinked in surprise when she saw her father sitting at the breakfast table, a mug of coffee in front of him. "Good morning, sweetheart," Richard said, his voice awkward but gentle. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You're home?" "Yes, and I'm staying home today. I thought maybe we could spend the day together, just us." Emily hugged the rabbit tighter. "No piano lessons?" "No piano lessons," he promised. "No tutors, no work, just you and me." A flicker of something, uncertainty, maybe even hope, crossed her face. She nodded slowly, as if testing whether he really meant it. Richard suggested Central Park. The air was crisp with early spring, and the city buzzed with life. Vendors sold pretzels and balloons. Joggers wove through the paths. Children laughed as they chased each other near the playgrounds. Emily clutched his hand tightly at first, her small fingers cool against his, as though afraid he might let go. They rented a rowboat at the lake. Richard had never held an oar in years, and his strokes were clumsy, splashing water onto his expensive shoes. Emily giggled, soft at first, then louder when he grunted in frustration. "You're not very good at this," she teased, covering her mouth as if afraid she'd said too much. Richard laughed, genuinely, the sound surprising even him. "Guess not. Maybe you'll have to row us back." She shook her head, giggling again, and for the first time her laughter didn't feel forced. Later they walked along the paths, sharing a pretzel dusted with salt. Richard noticed how her eyes lit up at small things, the street performer playing the violin, the dogs leaping after frisbees, the smell of roasted nuts from a vendor's cart. He realized how little he knew of what made her smile. In the afternoon, instead of returning to the sterile quiet of the penthouse, Richard took her to a diner in Brooklyn he hadn't visited in years. The red leather booths were worn, the jukebox in the corner played soft tunes, and the air smelled of coffee and pancakes. It was a far cry from the polished restaurants he frequented, but Emily's eyes widened with wonder. "Can I have pancakes for lunch?" she asked, her voice small but daring. "Of course," Richard replied without hesitation. She beamed, as though the answer had been a gift. As they ate, Richard asked questions, simple ones, but questions he had rarely taken time to ask. "What do you like drawing the most? Who do you sit next to in class?" "What's your favorite book?" At first Emily answered cautiously, but little by little her voice grew steadier. She spoke about her teacher, about the drawings she kept hidden in her room, about the stories she wished she could share but was too shy to tell. Richard listened, really listened, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It was about moments, tiny, fragile, irreplaceable moments that he had been missing. That evening, as they walked back to the car, Emily slipped her hand into his without hesitation. She didn't say anything, but the gesture spoke louder than words. Richard squeezed her hand gently, his heart heavy with both regret and determination. For the first time he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could begin to rebuild the bridge between them. Yet beneath that hope was a lingering fear. He knew one weekend wasn't enough. Emily's trust was not a prize to be won overnight. It was a fragile seed, and he would have to prove again and again that he could nurture it. The experiment had begun, and its outcome would depend entirely on whether Richard Carter could keep showing up. The following days after their weekend together carried a strange stillness for Richard. He had expected to feel relief, perhaps even pride, for spending time with Emily. Instead, he found himself unsettled, haunted by moments he couldn't let go of. Her laughter at the park, the way her hand had slipped into his so trustingly, and the trembling question she had asked weeks before. "Do you still love me, even if I'm not perfect?" That question lingered because it was one he had once asked himself, long before skyscrapers and penthouses. One night, after Emily had gone to bed, Richard poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat in his study. The city lights shimmered across the skyline, but his mind wandered far from Manhattan. He closed his eyes and found himself back in Chicago, on a street where the winter wind cut through thin jackets, and where silence at home was as cold as the air outside. His father's footsteps echoed in his memory, heavy, deliberate, always carrying the weight of exhaustion. The man came home from the steel mill with grease-stained hands and a permanent scowl etched into his face. Words were few, affection non-existent. Richard had longed for acknowledgement, for a pat on the back, for the simple reassurance that he was seen. Instead, he had grown up in shadows. When he brought home good grades, his father grunted. When he asked for help with homework, he was told, "Figure it out yourself. The world won't hand you anything." And when he dared to dream out loud about building tall buildings, about leaving Chicago, his father laughed bitterly. "You'll end up just like the rest of us," he had said. "Don't waste time dreaming." Richard remembered the sting of those words, the way they burrowed deep. He had vowed, silently and fiercely, that he would prove his father wrong. He would build everything the man said he couldn't. He would rise so high that no one could ever overlook him again. And he had done it. The skyline bore his mark, the papers printed his name. But sitting in his study, letter from Emily's teacher still on his desk, Richard realized how much of his life had been shaped not by ambition, but by absence. The bourbon burned his throat as he whispered to himself, "Am I doing the same to her?" Helen appeared at the doorway, her face soft with concern. "You're awake again," she said gently. Richard glanced at her, his eyes heavy. "Do you ever think children carry their parents' mistakes even when they try not to?" Helen stepped closer, folding her arms. "I think children carry what they're given, but parents can choose what to give." Her words cut through the haze. Richard pressed his lips together, staring at the amber liquid swirling in his glass. "I swore I'd never be like him. And yet, Emily looks at me the way I used to look at my father." Helen didn't argue. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder, a quiet reminder that change was still possible. "Then show her something different. It's not too late." Richard nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at him. Change required more than promises. It required presence, consistency, vulnerability. All the things he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Later, when the apartment was silent again, Richard stood at Emily's door. She was asleep, her rabbit tucked beneath her chin, her small chest rising and falling steadily. He lingered there, the sight of her innocence stirring something raw inside him. He whispered into the dark, not expecting her to hear, "I'll be better, Emily." "I have to be." But the question remained, could a man built on walls of steel truly learn to soften, or was he doomed to repeat the cycle he had fought so hard to escape? The past had resurfaced, and it would not let him go until he faced it fully. The classroom buzzed with energy that morning. Children whispered, laughed, and shuffled papers as Miss Thompson prepared the group for a reading exercise. The spring sun filtered through the windows, and yet Emily felt no warmth. Her palms were damp, her heart racing as she sat in her seat, clutching her pencil so tightly it left small indents in her skin. "Emily," Miss Thompson said kindly, "would you like to come up and read the next passage for us?" The words froze her. Dozens of eyes turned in her direction, and the room seemed to shrink. The letters on the page blurred, her chest tightened, and she could hear her own heartbeat louder than the voices around her. She rose slowly, every step to the front of the room heavier than the last. Her classmates waited. The teacher smiled encouragingly. But when Emily opened her mouth, the words refused to come. Her lips quivered. The paper in her hand shook. A faint murmur spread across the room, restless shifting, children whispering to each other. The pressure grew unbearable. Emily's vision blurred with tears she could no longer hide. She dropped the paper, her small voice breaking through in a whisper that cracked, "Please, I can't." Her knees buckled as sobs overtook her. Miss Thompson was at her side in seconds, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured, guiding her back to her seat. "You don't have to read right now, you're safe." But Emily couldn't stop trembling. Her small body shook, as if every fear she had held inside had finally broken free. The classroom fell silent, the other children staring in uneasy confusion. After class, Miss Thompson called Richard. She rarely reached out directly, but this time she couldn't stay silent. "Mr. Carter," she said firmly when he answered, "Emily had a breakdown today." She froze in front of the class, then collapsed in tears. "This isn't about grades or performance, it's about something deeper. She's carrying fear no child her age should carry." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. His instinct was to argue, to insist Emily was simply shy. But Miss Thompson's tone left no room for dismissal. "She doesn't need more lessons or pressure," the teacher continued. "She needs you. She needs to know she is safe with you, that she is loved without conditions. Can you understand that?" Her words struck like a verdict. Richard sat in silence, his throat tight. For the first time, he couldn't deflect or excuse. He could only whisper, "I'll come get her." When he arrived at the school, Emily was sitting in the office with red, swollen eyes, her rabbit clutched against her chest. She looked smaller than ever, fragile in a way that twisted something deep inside him. "Daddy," she whispered when she saw him, her voice raw. Richard crouched down, ignoring the polished shoes and tailored suit that no longer seemed to matter. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry I wasn't before, but I'm here now." Emily buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking into his shirt. He held her tightly, a lump rising in his throat. For the first time, he didn't feel like Richard Carter, the businessman. He felt only like a father holding a child who was breaking under a weight too heavy for her small frame. As he carried her out of the school, Miss Thompson watched from the doorway. Her eyes were steady, not accusing, but urging. Richard met her gaze, nodding slightly. He understood. He couldn't fix this with money or power. The real work had to begin now. And as Emily clung to him, whispering between sobs, "Don't leave me, Daddy," Richard felt the truth settle in his chest like a vow. The silence in the penthouse after Emily's breakdown was unlike any silence Richard had ever known. It wasn't the emptiness of a vast apartment or the quiet hum of the city beyond the glass. It was the silence of reflection, of reckoning. He sat in the living room that night with Emily curled against him, her small breaths uneven from hours of crying. For once, he didn't retreat to his study or lose himself in paperwork. He simply stayed, holding her, realizing that presence, not perfection, was what she craved. The next morning, he decided something had to change. No more tutors filling her afternoons, no more endless schedules that left no space for joy. When Helen reminded him of the piano teacher arriving at 3, Richard shook his head. "Cancel it," he said firmly. Helen blinked. "Cancel?" "Richard, you never cancel her lessons." "I'm cancelling all of them," he replied. "From now on, I'm the one scheduling her time." That afternoon, instead of piano drills, Richard sat with Emily on the floor of her room, surrounded by colored pencils and sketchbooks. "Show me what you like to draw," he said. Emily hesitated, her rabbit in her lap, as though expecting criticism. Then slowly she slid a sketchbook toward him. Inside were drawings of the city, some detailed, some messy, all filled with small figures, sometimes standing alone, sometimes holding hands. "These are incredible," Richard murmured, flipping through the pages. "Emily, you see the world differently. You see it with heart." Her cheeks flushed at the praise. "You're not mad I draw instead of practice piano?" "Mad." Richard shook his head. "Sweetheart, this is you. And I want to know you, not just the things you're told to do." For the first time, Emily smiled without hesitation. The following days carried small changes that felt monumental. At bedtime, Richard began reading aloud to her, fumbling through the voices of fairy tale characters and laughing at his own mistakes. Emily giggled until she had to catch her breath, her eyes glowing in a way Richard hadn't seen in years. He started asking her questions, not about grades or performance, but about her thoughts, her feelings, her dreams. "What do you like best about school?" he asked one evening as they ate dinner together. Emily paused, twirling her fork. "When Miss Thompson reads to us. She makes the stories feel real." "And what about your least favorite part?" Emily lowered her gaze. "When I have to talk in front of people, I get scared." Richard reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "You don't ever have to be perfect for me. Do you understand? I love you even when you're scared." Her eyes shimmered, the weight of his words sinking slowly into her fragile trust. She nodded, though doubt still lingered in the corners of her expression. Richard knew rebuilding her faith in him would take more than promises. She had learned to expect distance, and now she was testing his consistency. Sometimes she refused to speak much at all, retreating into her drawings. Other times, she looked at him as though waiting to see if he would disappear again into his world of deals and deadlines. But Richard stayed. Day after day, meal after meal, bedtime after bedtime, he stayed. Each choice to sit beside her, to listen instead of lecture, to laugh instead of scold, became a brick in the fragile bridge between them. Late one night, as Emily drifted to sleep, she whispered, "You're really here, Daddy." Richard leaned down, kissing her forehead. "I'm here, always." And for the first time, he began to believe he could make those words true. Still, deep inside, he wondered, was his effort enough to erase the years of absence, or was this only the beginning of a much harder journey? The question lingered, but he knew one thing. He would not walk away again. The storm rolled in without warning, sweeping across Manhattan with heavy rain and sudden winds. By evening, thunder rattled the windows of the penthouse, and the city below blurred under sheets of water. When the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, Emily gasped and clutched her rabbit. "It's all right," Richard said quickly, striking a match and lighting a candle on the dining table. The golden glow flickered across their faces, softening the vast emptiness of the apartment. For once, the silence wasn't filled by hums of machines or the buzz of city lights. It was raw and complete. Emily sat close to him, her knees tucked to her chest. "I don't like the dark," she whispered. Richard placed an arm around her shoulders, pulling her against him. "I used to be scared of it too," he admitted, surprising himself with the confession. Her wide eyes turned toward him. "You?" "Yes," he said with a faint smile. "When I was your age, the power went out in Chicago all the time. I used to hide under the blankets, convinced the shadows were coming for me. But my mum, she'd light a candle just like this and tell me stories until I forgot to be afraid." Emily's gaze softened. "What kind of stories?" Richard thought for a moment, the memories surfacing slowly. Stories about people who were brave, even when they didn't feel brave inside. She said bravery wasn't about not being scared. It was about not letting fear stop you. Emily leaned her head against his chest, her voice barely audible. "I don't feel brave." He kissed the top of her hair. "You're braver than you think, Emily. Every day you go to school, every time you try something even though you're afraid, that's bravery. You don't have to be perfect to be brave." The thunder rolled again, shaking the windows. Emily's small fingers clutched his shirt. "Please, no more," she whispered, her old phrase surfacing again. But this time, Richard heard something different in her words. She wasn't talking about lessons or pressure. She was asking for reassurance, for a promise that she wouldn't be left to face her fears alone. He tilted her chin gently so she would look at him. "Emily, when you say no more, do you mean you're afraid I'll leave? Like your mum?" Her eyes filled instantly, the truth spilling out in a rush of tears. "Yes, she left, and I think maybe you will too. You're always gone. What if one day you don't come back?" The confession shattered him. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he could without crushing her small frame. "No, Emily, I will not leave you. Not ever. I can't change what happened with your mum, but I promise you, I am here and I'm not going anywhere." Her sobs shook against his chest, but little by little they quieted, her breathing steadying as she clung to his words. For the first time, he felt the fragile barrier between them breaking. They sat together in the candlelight, thunder echoing like a distant drum. Emily drew small circles on his sleeve with her fingertip, a nervous habit that now felt almost trusting. "Tell me a story," she whispered, echoing the memory he had just shared. Richard smiled faintly. "All right. Once there was a little girl who thought she wasn't brave. But what she didn't know was that her heart was stronger than she ever imagined." As he spoke, Emily's eyelids grew heavy, her body relaxing against him. The storm outside raged on, but in that moment, Richard realized something profound. Connection wasn't built on grand gestures or perfect words. It was built here in the dark, in the quiet, with honesty and presence. For the first time in years, father and daughter shared not just a home but a bond. And though the storm outside eventually passed, the promise made that night would echo far longer than thunder. The storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean by the night's heavy rain. From the penthouse windows, Manhattan glimmered under a fresh clarity, the streets slick with reflections of neon and headlights. Yet inside, Richard felt a different kind of clarity taking root, one that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the little girl who had fallen asleep in his arms the night before. Emily stirred awake in the morning light, rubbing her eyes with small fists. Her rabbit was tucked securely against her chest, but when she saw her father still sitting in the chair beside her bed, her lips parted in surprise. "You didn't leave," she whispered. "No," Richard said, his voice steady, "and I won't." The words hung in the air, fragile but powerful. He could see how much she wanted to believe them, yet how uncertain she still was. Trust wasn't built overnight, and he knew his promises would mean nothing if his actions didn't follow. Later that day, as Helen prepared breakfast, she glanced at Richard with raised brows. "You stayed with her all night?" He nodded. "She needed me." "She's always needed you," Helen replied softly. Then, with a small smile, she added, "Maybe now you finally see it." Richard didn't argue. He simply sat with Emily at the table, sharing pancakes instead of rushing off to another meeting. Each bite felt like a choice, a decision to be present. That afternoon, Emily drew again, sprawled across the living room rug. This time she sketched not skyscrapers towering over lonely figures, but two people standing side by side, holding hands. She glanced up shyly when she noticed him watching. "Is that us?" Richard asked. Emily nodded, her cheeks pink. "I don't want to draw alone anymore." His throat tightened. He knelt beside her, placing a hand over the paper. "Then you won't." "I promise, Emily, you'll never be alone again. I will be here no matter what." Her eyes widened, shimmering with tears, but this time they weren't born of fear. They were tears of fragile hope, of longing, daring to believe. "Even if you're busy?" she asked carefully. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Even then, work can wait." "You can't." She let out a shaky breath, as though releasing a weight she had carried for years. "I want to believe you." "Then let me prove it," Richard said softly. From that day, he began weaving his promise into the fabric of their lives. When she showed him her drawings, he didn't just nod. He asked questions, listened to the stories behind the pictures. When she grew quiet at dinner, he filled the silence with gentle conversation, never pushing too hard but always making space for her voice. One evening, Emily whispered, "Daddy, can you read to me again? The story about the girl who was brave?" Richard smiled, pulling the book from her nightstand. "Of course." As he read, his voice steady in the soft glow of the lamp, Emily curled closer. "You sound different now," she murmured sleepily. "Different how?" "Like, you mean it." The words cut deeper than she could know. He kissed her forehead gently. "I do mean it. Every word." Helen, watching from the doorway, wiped a tear from her cheek. She had seen the cracks in Richard's armor for years, but now she was witnessing something else, something stronger than any empire he had built. For Richard, the promise was no longer just spoken. It was alive, tested daily, etched into every small moment with his daughter. And though he still feared the shadows of his past, he knew one truth with certainty. Emily would never again have to whisper, "Please no more," into an empty room. This time he would be there to answer. The days following Richard's promise to Emily were filled with a rhythm he had never known before. Breakfast shared without haste, afternoons with sketchbooks instead of boardrooms, evenings spent reading by lamplight rather than answering endless emails. For the first time, Richard Carter's life revolved not around deals, but around his daughter. But life has a way of testing convictions. One morning, while Richard and Emily were laughing over her latest drawing, a rabbit in a suit holding a briefcase, his phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with the name of a powerful investor. Richard frowned, hesitating, then silenced the call. Emily looked at him curiously. "You're not answering?" she asked. "Not now," he said, ruffling her hair. "I'm busy with something more important." Her smile widened, but even as he spoke, the phone buzzed again and again, a relentless reminder of the world outside. Later that day, Daniel came by with a folder under his arm. "You're not going to like this," he said, as he set it on the table. Richard opened it, scanning the documents. It was a proposal, one of the biggest deals of his career, an international expansion that could double his empire's value. But it came with strings attached, constant travel, months overseas, endless negotiations. "This is the opportunity everyone dreams about," Daniel said carefully, "but it won't wait. They need you on the next flight to London if you're serious." Richard closed the folder, his jaw tight. For a moment, the old reflexes kicked in, the instinct to leap, to conquer, to expand. It was who he had always been. But now, Emily's face flashed in his mind. The thought of her waking up to another empty chair at breakfast, whispering, "Please, no more," into the silence, nearly broke him. "She needs me," Richard said finally, his voice low but steady. Daniel studied him. "I know, but let's be honest. You've spent your life chasing these chances. Are you ready to walk away from one like this?" Richard leaned back, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. For years he had defined success by skyscrapers and bank accounts. But what was the point of building towers if his daughter's world crumbled in their shadow? That night, he sat with Emily as she colored. "Sweetheart," he began, careful with his words, "what would you think if Daddy had to go away for a while? For work?" Her crayon stilled. She didn't look up. "How long?" "A few weeks, maybe more." She hugged her rabbit tightly, her voice trembling. "You said you wouldn't leave." Richard's chest ached. "I know, and I don't want to, but sometimes—" "Then don't," Emily interrupted, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please, Daddy, don't." The plea was simple, but it carried every ounce of fear she had confessed to him during the storm. In her mind, leaving for weeks was no different from leaving forever. Richard pulled her into his arms, the decision solidifying in his chest like stone. "I won't," he whispered into her hair. "I promise, Emily. I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, he called Daniel. "Turn it down," he said firmly. Daniel sighed, though there was respect in his voice. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." When he hung up, Richard felt something he hadn't expected, relief. For the first time in his life, walking away from a deal felt like a victory. That evening, as he tucked Emily into bed, she whispered, "You stayed?" "Yes," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "And I always will." Daniel's words echoed in his mind later, quiet but true. "Now you are rich in what truly matters." The weeks that followed carried a rhythm unlike any Richard had ever known. For years his life had been defined by urgent calls, towering contracts, and the endless chase for more. But now mornings were filled with the sound of Emily's laughter drifting through the penthouse, afternoons spent sketching side by side, evenings reading stories until sleep pulled her gently into dreams. He noticed the changes in her first. The trembling that once marked her every word began to fade. At school, Miss Thompson reported she was raising her hand more often, speaking in a voice steadier than before. Helen, who had watched quietly from the margins for so long, told him one evening, "She's lighter now. You've given her something she was waiting for all along." Richard nodded, though he knew the truth went deeper. He hadn't given Emily anything new. He had simply stopped withholding the one thing she had always needed, himself. One afternoon in Central Park, they sat together on a bench, the trees budding with the promise of summer. Emily clutched her sketchbook, drawing with quick strokes while Richard watched. She had drawn two figures again, but this time there were no towering skyscrapers looming over them, no shadows stretching between. Just a father and daughter holding hands beneath an open sky. "Do you like it?" she asked, tilting the page toward him. "I love it," he said, his voice steady with pride. "It's us." Emily's smile was soft, but her words carried weight. Please, no more. Richard frowned gently. No more what, sweetheart? She leaned her head against his arm. No more sadness. The words struck him with a tenderness he could barely hold. He kissed the top of her hair. No more sadness, he promised. Not if I can help it. The vow wasn't made in grand gestures or gilded words. It lived in the simplicity of being present, of choosing her every day over the glitter of the world outside. For a man who once measured wealth in contracts and towers, Richard had discovered a different kind of fortune, the immeasurable richness of being a father. That evening, as the sun set over Manhattan, the city's glow painted their home in hues of orange and gold. Richard sat beside Emily on the couch, their laughter filling the space that had once echoed with silence. He looked at her, this little girl who had once trembled in fear, and felt something settle inside him, a peace he had never found in boardrooms or headlines. He realized that the true empire he wanted to build was not made of glass and steel, but of love and trust. Helen, watching quietly from the kitchen, caught his eye and smiled knowingly. Daniel's words returned to him as well. Now you are rich in what truly matters. For the first time, Richard believed it. Emily rested her head on his shoulder, whispering softly before drifting to sleep, "I'm glad you stayed." And he held her close, knowing that in staying, he had finally found what he had been searching for all his life. Before we close this chapter, if Emily and Richard's journey touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this one. And remember, click on the video now appearing on your screen to continue this journey with us, because sometimes the most powerful stories are not about empires built in the sky, but about the quiet, unshakable bonds that hold us together.